Hello, I'm Dr. 𝗘𝗦𝗓𝗧𝗦, and I'm absolutely delighted and honored to have Dr. Tricia Jenkins with me today. Tricia is a podcaster and professor of film, TV, and digital media at TCU in Fort Worth, Texas. She's the author of 3 books, including The CIA in Hollywood, which I received, which looks awesome. But more interestingly for my audience, her podcast, Worldwide, The Unchosen Church, features stories about growing up in the worldwide Church of God, a doomsday apocalyptic cult. And Dr. Jenkins, is it okay for me to call you Tricia for the rest of the interview? Thank you so Thanks so much. So this cult was founded by
Herbert W. Armstrong.
And what year approximately?
He starts out as a radio broadcaster in the 1930s, and he dies in 1986. So for a good 56 years, he's at the helm of the Worldwide Church of God.
And this was on ABC on Sunday mornings at some point?
Yeah. So one of the reasons that Herbert W. Armstrong was successful, I think, as a cult leader was that he was always a very early media adopter. So he was buying radio time for his ministry in the 1930s, and he enters into TV in the 1950s. And he does have a television broadcast called The World Tomorrow, which ran actually on Sunday mornings, which is unusual because we were a Sabbatarian church. So we went to church on Saturdays. That ran in the United States anyway. It was syndicated overseas in several countries, but yes, did run on ABC on Sunday mornings in the United States.
Yes. So this is a cult that I've actually helped people with decades ago. It's fascinating. I think your production values as well as the content is extremely good. So I'm going to just say publicly, if you were ever in the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Moonies or the Assemblies of God or any number of other Bible-oriented cults, I think you're going to see a lot of parallels. We'll talk about that in this interview. So I'm going to just open it up and say there was a hodgepodge of different beliefs and practices that he adopted. He had no seminary training. His background was in media and marketing advertising, right? Well, let's go back and say you were raised in this. What's it like growing up in apocalyptic cult? Because I know for sure, like in the Moonies, we thought the last days were now and the end of the world was coming any second. Please share with our listeners.
Yeah. So one of the things I talk about in the very first episode of my podcast is that as a kid, I never really envisioned myself growing into adulthood. I never envisioned myself getting married or having children or even really going to college. And that was because I was taught really from birth that the end of the world, and Armstrong preached that there would be a nuclear World War III in particular that was coming, if not in the next couple of months, maybe in the next couple of years, and certainly within our lifetime. But the sentiment was that it was coming in the next 5 years, 10 years as a very conservative estimate. Growing up in this, I never really made future plans in my mind because the idea was that why even think about where you're going to go to college, because you're going to be in what we call the place of safety, which is where the chosen of our church were going to ride out and be protected during this nuclear World War III. And then we were going to be turned into spirit beings and we were going to be rulers in the new world order that Christ was going to bring. And so I just never really envisioned myself really living an earthly existence past my teenage years.
Yeah. And speaking as a mental health professional, this is horrible. Child rearing practices. Let's go through some of the other things like corporal punishment. One of your podcasts, one of your guests talked about being brutalized, not just spanked.
I don't know how widespread physical abuse was in families in the Worldwide Church of God. It was not present in my family. I will say, though, that the Worldwide Church of God always preached that spankings were appropriate. They did have a message, though, that you weren't supposed to spank your children when you were angry. It was supposed to be something that was like a logical punishment rather than one that was hate filled or emotion filled.
Hmm.
However, because so in my second episode, I have an interview with a guy named Jessie Moskal, whose father was a minister in the Worldwide Church of God. And based on my interviews and my relationships with people who were children, ministers in the Worldwide Church of God, I do think that physical abuse, or at least corporal punishment that went above the level of spanking, was more common. And I think that that really came from this authoritarian mindset that the church had and filtered its way down to the leadership.
Yeah, spare the rod, spoil the child. They take that from the Torah, the Jewish scriptures, and they say, abide by that. And if I'm remembering correctly, because I've listened to your podcast, the first 3 episodes have now come out when we're doing this interview, the cult also didn't encourage people to go to medical doctors, get psychiatric help if they're feeling depressed. Share a little bit more about that whole thing.
Yeah, so this is one of what I would consider to be the more tragic elements of the Worldwide Church of God. Really, all throughout the 60s and the 70s and well into the 80s and 90s, the mindset was, and Herbert W. Armstrong would preach, doctors don't know why diseases happen. They don't really know how to cure them. Modern medicine is something not to be trusted. And really, the best cure for any disease, and that included cancer, was prayer and faith. And also, we did something called anointing. If you were sick, for instance, you would call on your pastor and he would literally take a cloth and put olive oil on it and say a prayer over it and send it to your house, or maybe deliver it to you personally. And you would put this anointing cloth on your forehead, and that was meant to do the trick.
Oh, I've seen many people doing that during COVID, and you don't need a vaccination. Just have that blessed handkerchief and you'll be protected. And then a lot of people were dying.
Yeah, and that's why I think this is one of the more tragic elements of the church. So, for instance, again, in that first episode when I talked to Jessie Moskal, he starts out, with this really horrific story of his 3-year-old sister is diagnosed with leukemia from environmental toxins, and before she reaches her 4th birthday, she dies. And really, one of the major reasons is that his parents refused to seek medical treatment. And that story it is far more common in the Worldwide Church of God than you would think. It affected my family as well. So one of the things that I share in my podcast is that, and this is in the 90s, my dad struggled with mental health and depression when he was in his late 40s and early 50s. And he was really ardent that he didn't want to take antidepressants, and he was not a fan of therapists. And he really tried to cure his depression with natural remedies, with supplements or with diet. And unfortunately, he ended up committing suicide in, right when I was around 19 or 20.
I'm so sorry.
Thank you. And I can't help but wonder if his fate and my future as well would have been different if we had not been a member of the Worldwide Church of God at the time.
Oh, I would say guaranteed that it would have been different. And what was one of the points in your podcast was that the cult leader himself would go to doctors, but so the hypocritical aspect. I'm also now thinking of another cult, the Way International, with Victor Paul Whale-Will, who did the faith healing thing, but he went to doctors too, and he died of cancer himself. Do you think that maybe Armstrong stole this from Mary Baker Eddy and Christian Science?
Yes, I think if you look at the teachings of Herbert W. Armstrong and the Worldwide Church of God, he essentially borrows what I would call like the greatest hits from different religions. Just to give you some examples, like the Jews, he borrowed, the Old Testament holy days and dietary restrictions in eating clean and unclean meats. Like the Seventh-day Adventist, we kept a 7th-day Sabbath. Certainly, like Christian Science, we had a reluctance to rely on medicine, and that God was really to be called upon for healing. We even borrowed from the Mormons that our church taught that after the return of Christ, that the chosen who had been called into the church, and there were only supposed to be 144,000 of us, that after Christ's return, that we would be turned into gods, and we would essentially have our own planets that
that
we could
is
rule.
The Mormon stuff. Yeah.
So he definitely borrowed from several different religious traditions. And the other sort of weird element of Armstrong was he had this belief that was called British Israelism, which taught that the lost tribes of Israel, when they migrated out of the Middle East, he taught that they actually migrated into Western Europe and that they actually became the countries of Western Europe. And he taught this idea that the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, who special promises are made to in the Bible, actually became the people of Britain and then later the US. He argued that if you want to understand why Britain had this amazing empire or why the US has always had, a great economy and has been sort of a world power, that you could trace that back to this understanding of British Israelism and the promises that God made to these tribes in the Bible. So that was also sort of like a weird tenet that was really central to a lot of what he taught in terms of biblical prophecy.
Yeah, call to elitism, that you're chosen, you're special, and I believe you have to be part of the 144,000 and everyone else is going to be toast.
Yes.
Right?
And as a kid, that scared me because I kept always asking my mom, like, how many people are in our church? And she would say, oh, I think there's about, like 120, 150,000. And I was like, 150,000? That's like 10,000 over what or 6,000 over what we're supposed to have. Like, why are we spreading the word? Why are we, why are we trying to bring more converts in? That's just like, you're jeopardizing my place in the kingdom. Like, let's knock this off. Let's stop.
Yeah, the Jehovah's Witnesses solved that one with saying everyone else will live forever on planet Earth. That was how they try. If you weren't part of the elite, the elect, then the rest of you can stay on Earth forever and never get old. Another parallelism between your former cult and my former cult, the racist teachings about the three sons of Noah and the doctrine of Ham.
One of the things, and this is not unique to the Worldwide Church of God, different denominations of Christianity and Islam and Judaism have all have a version of this. But essentially, there's a story in the book of Genesis where Noah gets drunk and he passes out, and Noah's son Ham walks into the room and sees, quote unquote, the nakedness of his father. And he doesn't cover him up, but he goes to tell his brothers, hey, like, dad's passed out, he's drunk and he's naked. And his brothers come in and cover him up. For some reason, it's not really explained in the passage. Noah is very upset with Ham. And so Noah, by the way, not God, but Noah curses not Ham, but Ham's son, Canaan, and condemns Canaan and all of his ancestors to a life of slavery. Now, there's no mention of race in that story. Race or skin color is never mentioned. It's not a curse that God makes. It's a curse that Noah makes. But that passage has been used to say, where do races come from? Ham is meant to be, in this weird biblical interpretation, the father of African people. And it's a passage that gets used essentially as an explanation, not just for Black skin, but as really a justification for the slavery of Black people. And our church certainly taught the curse of Ham, and that was the reason that slavery existed and why different races existed.
Yeah. And you interviewed a former member who's Black about what it was like growing up there. He was obviously... is very bright and was like talking about, was it the Bible Bowl or something where there's a competition of, say a little bit about that.
Yeah.
I thought that was funny.
So we had a very, very active youth program. Each church area had sports teams, a basketball team, and we would play other congregations. But one of the other activities that we had was what we called Bible baseball tournaments. And it was literally set up. I'm trying to remember this now. It was literally, so you did it as a team, and each question had a point value. So easy ones were a single, really hard ones were a triple. And your team had to answer Bible questions. And it was a lot of like, you had to quote biblical scripture, or you had to know the chapter and verse of something. And you would essentially, with each question answered correctly, like hit your team around the bases. And that was how you won. So the standout members of a Bible baseball team would compete in an all-star championship. And that was just like an individual competition. And so his name is Glenn Washington. He's actually the host of NPR's Snap Judgment, which is a really successful podcast. He was a Bible baseball champion, and so was I. And so one of the things that he talks about is, the church was saying, well, this is in the Bible, right? It's clear from the Bible that Noah's son Ham is the father of African Americans and African people. And he would say, no, like, I'm a Bible Bowl champion. I know my Bible. That is nowhere in the Bible. So he talks about like how he really actually thinks that whole Bible baseball event or program actually sort of planted the seeds of its own destruction, because people did learn the Bible and did know what was in it and what wasn't in it, and could then call out authority and say, no, that's not actually there.
So I want to just comment. You're a PhD scholar, author, teacher, obviously incredibly bright, and you commented that so many of your fellow former cultists have gone on to achieve really quite a lot. You want to share a few stories?
So our church had an accredited university. It was called Ambassador University. We used to have 3 campuses. By the time I went through the church, we were down to 1, and that was in Big Sandy, Texas. When I look at the people that I went to school with, and I look at where they are now, 20 years later, it is almost uncanny the number of PhDs, professors, lawyers, doctors, entrepreneurs, like highly successful, highly educated people that I really think disproportionately came out of that church. And I would love to be able to say, oh, it was because, I wish there was a common thread that I could link to it. And I don't know what it is, but I will tell you why I think, or at least what I would credit the church with in terms of my own academic success. In our church services were long. They were 2 hours.
Oh, that's short. Sorry. In the
well,
world
it felt like a long time.
They go on a lot longer than that. I'm sorry, continue.
No, and fair. So we would stand up at the beginning of a service, we'd sing 3 songs, we'd sit down, and there would be a 20-minute sermonette. And these were like lectures, essentially. We'd stand up and sing 1 song, we'd sit back down, and then for an hour and a half, we would have the sermon. Now, kids were not allowed to go to like some kid's room or play with toys on a blanket, or, today, like have your phone out. It was, you were going to sit in this chair and you were going to be quiet and you were going to be still and you were going to take notes. Even as a kid, my parents would make this like chart on a piece of paper that said like keywords like God, kingdom, devil, Satan, the tribulation, something like that. And every time I heard that word, I was meant to put a check in the column.
Ah.
And so as a kid, very early on, I was trained to listen to essentially very long, boring lectures, and pay attention for key concepts and to mark them down. And so I think in some ways that planted the seed of being a good student, then being able to go to a college class and to sit in a college class for 3 hours and be able to take good notes and to pay attention for the whole thing, because I'd really been trained to do that since I was, 5 or 6.
And was it a very misogynistic experience too, where men had more power than women? Because the Moonies were that way. In the Moonies, men were subjects and women were objects.
Yes, I think that is also true in the Worldwide Church of God. So I actually have an episode coming out tomorrow that has to do with gender and how it functions. And I interview 3 women. And one of the things that they note, so in our services, there was a way to sit. Men sat on the aisle, and then there was the woman, and then there was the children. And the reason that men always sat on the aisle is because they were the ones who needed to get up, because they had the leadership roles in the service. They were the ushers, they were the deacons, they were the song leaders, they were the, people giving the sermonettes or the sermon or giving announcements or an opening and closing prayer. The only leadership role that women had in our church was to be the piano player, or to perhaps lead we called them YES lessons. They were like our youth educational programming for like 5, 6, 7-year-olds.
Were people allowed to go to public school, or were they homeschooled?
Some people were homeschooled. I did not know anybody in my local congregation who was homeschooled. And that was also something that was interesting about the church, I think. We did not have a compound. So for those of us, most of our parents, they came from a quote unquote normal world, and they chose this religion because they were attracted to its ideologies or its sense of community.
Or they got deceived.
Or they were deceived, absolutely.
Thinking that Armstrong actually knew the Bible.
Was God's apostle, yeah.
Yeah.
But for us 2nd generation members, we were born into this, and this was our normal. but we always recognized that this was not normal because we went to public school. And because our church taught that, traditional holidays like Christmas or Valentine's Day or Halloween were pagan holidays that were sinful to celebrate, that meant, every time my elementary school had a Halloween party, I couldn't like bring a costume and do the little parade. And I had to sit in the hallway. I had to sit it out. And I just sat there, longing for that gross little cookie with the orange frosting on it,
That's so funny.
because I couldn't participate in it. And
Yeah.
I actually think, people have asked me, like, do you have a hangover from the Worldwide Church of God that's still with you after all of this time? And I think I have two. One is that I still will only go to the doctor if it is like, I don't want to say dire, but it's like I got to be sick a long time to finally get myself to a doctor. I think I'm getting better about it, but like 4 years ago, I had walking pneumonia. I just thought it was a cold, and then it got worse, and then I couldn't walk more than like 1,000 feet without having to sit down. And it took me like 3.5 weeks to finally go see a doctor.
Mm.
And I suffered for a long time. And then I took this Z pack, and then it, went away in like a couple of days. And I'm like, man, why did you wait so long? So that's one of the hangovers.
So can I interrupt you
Yeah,
and teach
absolutely.
you a healing strategy while we're chatting?
Absolutely.
So the first step in healing or fixing a hangover, I've never heard that expression before, like you were drunk and you have a hangover.
Yeah. Or the residue, I guess.
But the first step is just being aware that this element of indoctrination is still functioning. And then you want to ask yourself, what do normal people do? Like people who didn't grow up in a cult. And then you want to go back to when you first got sick but didn't do anything, and step back into your younger you and go, oh, this could develop into pneumonia. I should go to a doctor and have them listen to my lungs and get checked out. And by redoing it, even though historically you know what actually happened, right? But this is a way of rewiring your brain for the future, so that the next time if you get ill, you automatically call the doctor and not delay. And also set a good role model for you have a child, I believe, or
I do.
is it,
I've got a daughter.
yeah, that's wonderful. So the idea is identifying the triggers of the leftover programming, saying what's normal or what's healthy, or how do I really want to act? Go back in your mind to that earlier scene, reprogram it, and then imagine the future where something comes up and you're behaving the way you want to behave. It's amazing how fast the human mind can be rewired. And that's what I teach with my clients. So I just wanted to share that with you, because there's no need to keep reprogramming the dysfunctional thing from your childhood. Well, let's go on to the other one that you were going to talk about.
So the other one I'm less excited to say out loud, but I just believe in being truthful and authentic. So I think, growing up in this church where we were the oddballs out in public school, I was taught to kind of wear that oddness as a badge of honor, right? Because it meant that I was special and that I was chosen and that I was set apart. And never, and this is generational, but it also has to do with my religious upbringing. There was never, ever, ever a sense that the rest of the group or the rest of society should ever make any accommodations to me. Yeah, I can't celebrate Halloween. I've got to sit in the hall while this party is going on. But there was never any expectation that that party shouldn't happen, right? And there was this sense of, yeah, I can't do this, but there's a good reason why I can't do this. And people don't need to accommodate me. Right. I think that mentality is still with me in some ways. I think Gen Z is now much more sensitive and sympathetic to people who are on the margins. And in some ways, that is a wonderful and a very beautiful thing. But there's still a part of me that struggles with accommodating what I would see as like minority interest groups. And I don't mean this like in a broad sense of, like race relations in the United States, but something like if you have a birthday party and there's a kid who can't eat gluten, right? A lot of parents now will make a cake that is gluten-free so that kid can participate like all of the other children.
Mhm.
And I still have this mentality of, but you're the one with the gluten allergy. So, bring your own piece of cake, or I don't know what I want to say, but like it just in my mind, the way I grew up, there was no expectation that the rest of the group should ever accommodate me and my specialness. And I'm still struggling with that.
So, if I may, we all carry baggage from our childhood. And those people that I've worked with who were born or raised in an authoritarian cult, like you were, those, for lack of a better way of saying it, those child parts are still operational. But the strategy is, and there are a number of ones, and I always just tell my clients, here's some different strategies. Pick one that works for you, try it out. And if it doesn't, I can tweak it and give you some other strategies. But a simple one would be to imagine you're time traveling back, a la Star Trek or one of these sci-fi shows. You time travel back to the younger Tricia and you say, honey, I'm from the future. We're going to be a doctor and teach at a university and write books. And you know what? Armstrong isn't the apostle. The world's not going to end. You're going to be a parent. You're going to travel the world. You're going to have this and that, and interact with that child part so that you have that connection and bring that part into the now, because the now is who you are today, if you're following me. And I've done so many cases where people have left the cult, but their cult identity was still on automatic pilot. And I encourage people, be in your body, be in the present, and heal your younger you. And even go back and exit counsel yourself, your younger self, and explain the bite model of authoritarian control and the influence continuum and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. And one of the things that I found so rewarding about doing this podcast is that I've literally gotten, we just premiered last week, probably over 100 messages from people who said, I was pretty sure that I had left this all behind, like 20. So Armstrongism still exists in some forms today. It's still very much alive and well. But a lot of people exited in the 1990s.
And I want you to tell the story of how that came about, but continue.
Sure. But they've emailed me and said, I really thought I put this all behind me. Like I moved on and I just kind of forgot about it. But now that I'm listening to this podcast, I'm realizing that there are some things that I didn't fully process, that I didn't fully work through, and they're finding the podcast to be therapeutic. And that's the most wonderful message that I could receive. So
it's incredible. It's a great contribution, but also for yourself as well. It's just incredibly marvelous. Let's take a moment to go back to the history. So Herbert W. started it. Then what happened? And
I will try to tell this in a succinct way.
You did a great job on the podcast. So we have a few minutes.
So Herbert W. Armstrong, yes, he is the head honcho of the Worldwide Church of God. He had a son who was actually called the man with the golden throat. He was the most popular televangelist in American culture for a while. His name was Garner Ted. But Garner Ted was a playboy. He had a lot of affairs. He also proved to be a threat to his dad. So he was thought to be heir apparent, but he and his dad had a falling out, and Garner Ted ends up starting his own church in Tyler, Texas. So what happens is that Armstrong knows that he is sick. He's well up in his years. I can't remember how old he is when he dies, but it's like close to 90, maybe his late 80s. And he knows that he needs to pick a successor. There's a great book by David Barrett, who is a PhD, actually did his dissertation on the Worldwide Church of God and some of the splinter groups that come out of it. But he basically picks a successor, tells, his council of elders, this is who it is. And then he would change his mind 4 weeks later. And, oh, no, that's not him. It's this other person. And then 4 weeks would go by and he'd change his mind again. Long and the short of it is he picks a man named Joseph W. 𝗘𝗦𝗡, who is a son of Czechoslovakian immigrants. He was a pastor in the Worldwide Church of God. And that is who he had picked at that moment when he actually died.
Mhm.
So he transfers the title of the pastor general of the Worldwide Church of God to 𝗘𝗏𝗏. Interestingly, he had given himself the title of apostle, and he refused to transfer it to Joseph W. 𝗘𝗏𝗏. 𝗘𝗏𝗏 just appoints himself apostle anyway. But what I think is really interesting about this transfer of power is the Worldwide Church of God does something that it's not unprecedented, but it's not usual.
Mhm.
8 years into 𝗘𝗏𝗏𝗟's leadership, he gives a very famous sermon in 1994, which I was actually sitting in the 4th row for because he
Mm.
gave it at Ambassador University. And church members will now refer to it as the Changes sermon, because what he did in that sermon is he actually kind of de-radicalized the Worldwide Church of God. He said, you know what? We've only been looking at Old Testament. We haven't been looking at New Testament. We don't think that we actually need to do all of these things that we said you need to do in order to be saved. We were very much, you earned your salvation. It was not by grace, or it was not by faith.
It
You
was by
earned,
works, in other
yes.
words. Yeah.
And those works were you give 10% of your income, you don't eat pork, you don't eat shellfish, you don't celebrate Halloween, you don't celebrate Christmas. A whole host of rules that you had to follow in order to be saved. Joseph 𝗘𝗏𝗏 says, you know what? I think we've been wrong. And he basically starts to steer the church really in mainstream Protestant evangelical Christianity. What happens is half the church, it doesn't happen instantaneously, but they say, you know what? I actually think 𝗘𝗏𝗏𝗟 is kind of making good sense. We really haven't been looking at the New Testament, and there really hasn't been an emphasis on Jesus. And, Jesus is such an important part of Christianity in the New Testament, and they adopt the new teachings. And some of them continue to attend Worldwide Church of God as it becomes more mainstream. But there were so few congregations that people had to drive like a long way to get to church services. And so over time, maybe 4 or 5 years, it was like, well, we can go anywhere and still be saved. So let's just go to the local Methodist church down the road. The other thing that happened, though, is that the other half said, oh, screw you, false prophet. You are not the true, apostle of God.
Purists, the
Yes.
fundamentalists.
Yes. And so they broke away and they started their own churches. And those churches still very much exist today. They're the United Church of God, the United Church of God Worldwide Associated, the Philadelphia Church of God, the Restored Church of God. There was a power struggle in that, initial split. And so then you had splinters after the splinter. But absolutely, Armstrongism still very much exists today.
Yeah. So what was your moment where you were like, I'm exiting.
I'm out.
Yeah.
People ask me that a lot, and I usually point to 3 things that changed my trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
One is, so when 𝗘𝗏𝗏𝗟 gives this Changes sermon, I am, I think, 18, 19 years old. I'm a freshman in college. And I think I kind of had this moment of, wait a second, this guy, Herbert Armstrong, that you have taught me is infallible and has always been infallible. Now you're saying he was fallible. And I went, if that was wrong, what else might be wrong? And it sent me down this questioning of not just the Worldwide Church of God, but really of Christianity and religion much more broadly.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing that happens is, like I mentioned earlier, my dad ends up committing suicide. And I always remember the church preaching, God will never give you anything that you can't handle. And I looked around and said, but people commit suicide every day. That doesn't feel right. That doesn't feel authentic to me. So that also sent me down a questioning path. And then the third thing that happens is, after I graduate from college, the first thing that I did is I moved to Bangkok, Thailand. And I taught English as a second language at an international school there. And all of a sudden now I'm surrounded by Buddhists. And I come to understand these Buddhists as, incredibly lovely, kind, wonderful people. And I'm asking myself, do I really believe that all of these people that I know are going to burn in the lake of fire because they don't accept Jesus as their personal savior? And I came to understand religion as very geographically centered, that you believe what the people around you believe. And what you believe is largely determined by where you were born and where you grow up. So international travel became something that also sort of broadened my mind, and eventually I ended up leaving. I graduated from Ambassador University. I was the last graduating class out. The university closed in 1997, partly because in the changes, all the people who were like, yes, this makes good sense, we don't need to give 10% of our tithes anymore. The church lost a ton of money, and our university never had an endowment. So they closed the university. So I did finish my degree there. I graduated in 1997. I moved to Bangkok in 1998. And I would say after 1998, 1999, I never attended another service.
So I'm going to offer another little healing tip for people, especially who are born or raised in cults, is to pay attention to language. So I think Scientology may be the hardest in terms of language, because they literally have their own dictionary, and part of the cult is you should do study tech, and if you don't agree with something or you space out, it means you passed a word you don't understand, so you look it up in Hubbardese and you indoctrinate yourself. But the point I want to comment in what I was listening to is you said our university versus their university.
True.
Right?
True.
Because you want to be in the present and you want to talk about the cult back there, even though there are splinter groups and other people who are, walking around with the program beliefs that were concocted and stolen from a variety of other authoritarian cults and religions. But again, it comes back to, that was the younger me. I'm out. So when I talk about the Moonies, it was they, or I say when I was in the Moonies, this is what we felt, or this is what we taught, etc. By the way, the Moonies had an accredited university, also the University of Connecticut, Bridgeport. The TMers still have an accredited university in Fairfield, Iowa, Maharishi, whatever university. So, but anyway, let's what do I want to say next? Because this is so interesting and so fascinating. So you were in the last graduating class of ambassador. Then what? How did you decide what the next? Was that when you went to Thailand to just get a change? And were you teaching over there, or you were?
I did. It was my first job. I tell my students now, if you are a fluent English speaker, you never have to worry about being unemployed so long as you're willing to travel. There was good money to be had in teaching English overseas. After I left Bangkok, I spent a year in Germany as well. And actually, even that trajectory comes out of the Worldwide Church of God. So our church literally was worldwide. It operated in about 70 countries, to my understanding. The bulk of them were in the United States and the UK and Australia. But that meant, because we only had one university, that people from all over the world who wanted to be educated at God's one true college came to, of all places, Big Sandy, Texas, which is, it has a population of like 1,000 people. It is in rural East Texas. So it's this very unlikely place to have this like cosmopolitan hub. But I think about a third of our student body was from overseas, which meant that I made friends from India, from Australia, from New Zealand, from Canada. In fact, I just went on vacation last week with my roommate from Ambassador, and she's Canadian, and we had traveled overseas. And so that's, I was born and raised in a very small rural West Michigan town. I think my school was like 99% white. And so when I came to Ambassador, it was a much more multicultural, diverse environment that I had ever been in before. And those relationships actually really cultivated in me a curiosity and a love for international travel. And because I still have so many friends that I went to Ambassador with, or I was part of this church with, that I feel like I could go to any continent. I'm thinking about it, if this is really true. I could go to any continent except Antarctica and have somebody there that I could stay with.
Hmm.
And so that's one of the really wonderful things that came out of that experience.
So just for clarification, with the Moonies, if somebody leaves the Moonies, they're going to hell because they're not following God's will, etc. And if you're a member in good standing, aside from trying to recruit the person back in, you are not encouraged to have any type of social interaction. So my question is, all these folks that you're saying I could stay with anybody, are they all out also that you're talking about? Or are there any true believers that still are willing to be friends with you?
I still have friends who are in one of the splinter groups. They are all domestically located though. I think part of it, so definitely in the 70s, 80s and 90s, if you left the church or you questioned the church or you failed to follow its rules, you would probably be disfellowshipped. And certainly people were not encouraged to talk to you or to associate with you. But I think because of this weird time that I came through the church and that I graduated, 3 years after that changes sermon was given, there was just a lot of disarray in the church and people were figuring out, what side they were going to land on. And so I think a lot of that, I don't know what the word that I want is, but this like very, very black and white thinking that had become a little bit more gray by then.
That's a good way of saying it.
Yeah, and now most of the people that I am friends with are no longer a part of either the WCG or one of the splinter groups.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So I want to switch, if I may, to talking about, you've written several books, but this one really intrigued me. And you said, warning, Steve, it's academic. But please tell me how you came to get interested in this and what you learned in researching it.
So I have always been a lover of spy films, loved James Bond, loved the Jason Bourne trilogy, loved spy history, loved the history of intelligence organizations. And so I did my dissertation on the way that gender and nationalism intersected in American spy television series. And over the course of writing that dissertation, I came across a New York Times article, and it was talking about a show named Alias that came out in 2001, starred Jennifer Garner.
I remember
and it said, that. I loved that show. And it said something it was like 2 sentences. And it said, the CIA's Entertainment Liaison Office consulted on this series. And I went, what? What is a CIA Entertainment Liaison Office? And so I started Googling, I'm looking in the research databases. I can't find anything about this program. I can find that the FBI has a program. I can find that the Department of Defense has had this program for a long time. Could not find anything about the CIA. So after I graduated, this is my next project. I got to find out what this office is. So to give you the short version, it's useful to compare it to the Department of Defense. So a lot of people don't know this, but the Department of Defense has a very robust entertainment industry liaison office. And essentially what happens is a filmmaker wants to do something with a battle, or it's a war film or whatever, and they need really expensive equipment. They need aircraft carriers, they need helicopters, they need submarines. And so they go to the military and they say, hey, we need all this equipment. Here you guys are offering these for free or cut rate prices. What do we need to do to get on this action? And they say, show us your script. And they read the script and they literally make notes page by page that says, we don't look heroic on page 18. We're going to need to change page 18 if you want our equipment. And there are certain things that are showstoppers for the military, right? So any mention of mental health issues, especially PTSD or suicidal thoughts, those will be, they won't support that.
They want to portray a very positive image to the public.
Yes, absolutely. Drug addiction, things, sexual harassment, all of those things will be nixed. So the CIA, what happens? So the CIA is the last major government office to establish one of these programs. And they do it in 1997. And the reason why they do it is twofold. One, the Cold War has ended, and all of a sudden Congress is talking about, do we really need the CIA anymore? It was set up to fight the Soviets, and it was set up to fight communism, but now that threat seems to be over and done with. So do we really need to be spending, billions of dollars on this organization, or can we just transfer all the intelligence functions to the Department of Defense?
Right.
So they realize,
save a few hundreds of billions of dollars, I might add.
Yes, and so they panic, right? And it's like, we have to convince the American public that we are still needed and necessary. And one of the ways that they start to do that then is they say, we got to start working with film and TV producers. Like, we've got to start influencing the messages and the ideologies that these shows circulate to convince them that there are other threats. It's not just about communism. And I don't mean to sound crass when I say this, although it is going to sound crass, but 9/11 was actually great for the CIA in the sense that it reminded the public that actually, yes, there are threats that are not communist related, and we may need intelligence services to help thwart some of these threats. So that's one thing. And then the other thing that happened in the 90s that also was a big public relations disaster for them was the case of Aldrich Ames. He was a CIA mole. He worked in, actually, ironically, I'm pretty sure, counterintelligence, and he was selling out the names of Russian assets for millions of dollars that the Russians were paying him. It took the CIA a very long time to figure out who he was, and then when he was finally unmasked, all of the damage that he had done to intelligence services and how long it took to uncover him was a big public relations disaster for the CIA. And so they begin to then work with Hollywood in order to tell their success stories, to convince the public that they are a good investment, that they are effective, and that program is thriving today.
That's so interesting. So the FBI, their top counterintelligence person, Hansen, who was an Opus Dei member, a cult that I help people get out of, authoritarian Catholicism, was feeding our intelligence to the Russians for a really long time.
Yes.
I'm sure you came across the book called The CIA and the Cult of Intelligence by Marchetti and Marx in your research.
Yes.
When I first saw that, the whole book, it was hardcover, was blacked out. There was an and a the, and everything was, and over time they kept going to judges and winning back what the words were.
And that is still a challenge for academics today. A lot of our information has to come from freedom of information request. But a lot of times when you get those documents, it can take years to get them. And then when they do arrive, half of it can be redacted. And so it's a very frustrating process.
Yeah. So I can't help but say, since you're such a fan of Jason Bourne, and others, these spy things, it was a version of MK Ultra. Mind control to create the perfect assassin who would be completely obedient and have all these extra abilities. And what I learned after my exit from the Moonies, I was a whistleblower. I gave all the internal documents I had over to a congressional subcommittee investigation. And in this period of time, it was in the mid 70s, it was called Koreagate at the time, and the Moonies were named as covert operatives for the Korean CIA. And they actually interviewed the founder of the Korean CIA, who, quote, said he organized and utilized the Unification Church, my former cult, for use as a political tool. And so the history, as I understand it, is the CIA helped set up the Korean CIA. And they were saying, North Korea is brainwashing people. There have been 2 unsuccessful coups in South Korea. Korea is really important to us. We need to create a proxy group to brainwash dissidents in South Korea so that they don't, cause trouble. And it was only in that frame that the Moonies were then later brought to the U.S. during Watergate to defend Nixon, and I fasted for Nixon as a Moonie, etc. And of course, the Moonies set up the Washington Times newspaper that lost money for decades, And where was that money coming from? Let me figure that one out. So anyway, there's a whole really nefarious history to take into account. I mean, I do believe we need covert, agents and spies, etc. But there needs to be some checks and balances on this. It's such a high potential abuse for power. And but I wanted to say the MK Ultra thing because when I wrote The Cult of Trump, a lot of those believers are against the deep state, which they claim is the CIA, etc. And they may not realize that I'm actually a survivor of one of those mind control programs, because I was trained to kill on command or die on command. And that's part of what motivates me so passionately to this day, because I'm a nice guy. I would never think of murdering people, much less following some person's orders and not thinking about it or following my conscience. So it's really, interesting times we're living in right now.
Absolutely.
And I'm very grateful to your willingness to do the research, put together this podcast, find the people to interview, because I think it's part of I believe is a real movement of former members, especially what we call second generation, those born in these authoritarian cults, to share their stories and to destigmatize and lower the temperature for the fact that people can be in these authoritarian cults and get out and be really nice people and successful citizens and really interesting and make great contributions like yourself.
Yeah, one of the things that, I say in the podcast, I always am tempted when I'm in an icebreaker situation to say, hi, my name's Tricia. I was raised in a doomsday apocalyptic cult, just for like shock value, right? But I never want to say it because the word cult has got such heavy-handed, like very cringy connotations to it, right? That only stupid people or only lonely people or only like weirdos would ever be wrapped up in a cult. And when I look at, who it was who was part of, especially just my local congregation, they were very normal people. They had master's degrees and they had engineering degrees and they were, well-adjusted, for the most part, families. And
Right.
so I do think that people coming forward and telling their stories and saying, this is my experience and it doesn't match all of those stereotypes that I still think very much circulate in the world about who gets caught up in high demand religious groups, especially, that it's important for us to share our stories and to put a different face on it.
Yeah, and you're contributing in your social media efforts to the hashtag I got out and igotout.org, because I believe there are millions and millions and millions of us who, like you were describing earlier, exited, put it in a closet, closed the closet, said, I'm done with that. But they're still carrying around the residues and shame, maybe embarrassment to say about what they experienced and such.
Or anger about how many years they lost to the group.
That's a really important point. I'm really glad to hear you say that. I can tell you I've done a lot of work with former Jehovah's Witnesses, and especially women were second class and men were not encouraged to get advanced degrees at all because Armageddon was coming at any moment, right? And like brilliant people who wanted to have kids, but they were told you can't have kids because it's Armageddon, right? You put your time and effort into working with the group, but we're all role models. Say, hey, we can be successful. You're not alone, and there's no shame in it. And honestly, I just see almost like a renaissance happening with the cult field because there's so many documentaries are now being produced and great podcasts that are being developed. And I think the public has a hunger to understand this and to dissect it. My gripe, of course, with a lot of these documentaries is they're not going into the mind control, the use of hypnosis, the deception, the indoctrination of phobias, the loaded language that are installed in people. And so for me, I went back and got my doctoral diploma doing research on undue influence in the law, because I realized the law is out of date with what we understand about social psychology and neuroscience even. And we want justice. And if somebody is enslaving someone else psychologically in order to exploit them financially, at the very least, that's trafficking, and that is a crime. And trafficking is fraud, force, or coercion. And with my population, fraud and coercion rings the bell. Not all of the cults I work with, they have violence and guns and that sort of thing, like a Patty Hearst who's kidnapped into the SLA. So anyway, I'm just so grateful to you for your efforts. And I just want to tell our listeners that you actually contacted me to interview me for your podcast. And you said, I learned about you from an ex-member who said, you got to check out the bite model and this guy Hassan. And then we were chatting on. And I said, of course, I'll do a podcast. But by the way, can you help me with my social media since you are? And you said, I'm going to finish teaching soon, so I can give you some time. And I'm very grateful for you being willing to help.
Well, I'm so glad that I've gotten to know you, and I appreciate your work. You're certainly one of the leading thinkers on cult mentality. The bite model it has helped so many people that I've talked to who knew about it before I ever came to it or discovered it, and they credit that particular model for helping them think through their own situations and to realize, oh yeah, my organization does do all of these things, and maybe I really need to look at it differently. So yeah, it's been a pleasure.
I'm paying it forward because my family rescued me. I was deep in the rabbit hole, and that's also given me a lot of confidence that I can help anybody get out, because if I could get out, anybody can. I was that far gone. I was literally called the model member by Sun Myung Moon directly. And it was because I would kill on commands. You want me to chop off my finger? Give me the cleaver and I'll, chop it off to show my obedience and faith. It's crazy. So as we're wrapping up, any last thoughts that you would like to share with our listeners?
I think the only thing that I would say, and this is something that you have said before, and I think it's a really valuable lesson, which is that every high demand organization, whether it's, a Bible cult like I grew up in or something political like the Moonies, it's not all 100% negative. There are some really wonderful and positive things that come out of this really tight sense of community. And I think if we can recognize those things, it makes our relationship to that experience more healthy, more balanced, that you don't need to quote unquote, throw the baby out with the bathwater. That if you can learn to say, actually, but I learned this thing, right? Like I learned international travel, or I made, we had a big public speaking program, a Toastmasters club, right? And that's helped me in my career as a professor. There are things that we could take away from it that were really positive and really wonderful. And if we can hold on to those things and then just kind of figure out how to deal with and dispose of the rest, I think it makes that transition out and your future life a lot more wonderful.
You are very wise, and I'm very grateful that you're bringing this up, because in fact, there are very valuable life experiences that I learned in the Moonies that I took out with me. I was a shy, introverted poet when I went in, and within a few months, I was giving talks to a large group of people extemporaneously. And I learned that in the Moonies. And that, when I got out, I was like, I used to be able to talk, I could get up and not freak out. And so the idea is to not just take the whole thing and put it in a closet, but really sift through what the golden memories are and the experiences, and integrate it as a part of your life. So I'm really grateful that you said that. And, it's not a sin to want to be part of a community of like-minded people. We like being part of groups. A lot of people do. I'm an introvert, but I belong to a Jewish temple and have for 23 years. I like being together. If somebody has an illness, we bring them food. When I was sick, I had cancer, they helped drive me to the hospital when my wife couldn't do it. I like that sense of, continuity over time with other families. And, and I hear from a lot of former members who are, like hardened atheists, like extreme, like, don't talk to me about, I can't see the Bible anymore. I can't, and it's like, come on, like, get over it. Or somebody who tells me, Steve, I loved meditating, but now that I've left TM, I don't know what to do. I said, there are 1,000 other types of meditation you could be doing. You don't have to use the fraudulent mantra that they gave you. And they're like, I can. And I'm like, yeah, you're free now. You're an adult. You get to choose how you want to live.
That's one of the things that I will say that I find frustrating about American culture is that if you are not religious, if you don't go to a church, it is, as an adult, incredibly difficult to find community. I feel like a lot of the organizations that used to be around in the 50s don't really exist anymore, or they're not as, you think about the Lions Club, right? Or the VFWs, they used to be really robust organizations, and young people just aren't in those. And even middle-aged people are not really a part of those. And so it's very difficult to find a shared sense of community that exists outside of a religious organization. And so I think a lot of people who leave, organizations like mine, that's the thing they miss. They might not miss anything, but they damn well miss that sense of community because it's incredibly hard to replace.
Yeah, and having followers on social media is not the same as having real friends that you can sit down and schmooze with and hang out with, and
or bring you soup if you're sick. Yeah, no social media follower is going to do that.
Yeah, 1,000%. So thank you very much for coming into my life and asking me to contribute to your wonderful podcast. Really, folks, check out this podcast. And if people want to contact you, is there an email address you want to share, or is there a website? We're going to do a blog with the video of this, and then we can add links. But just for the podcast listeners, is there a way for people to?
Yes. So if you want to reach out to us, you can do it social media. So we are at Worldwide Pod 11 on both Twitter and Facebook. We have an Instagram account, which is probably our most active community. That is just Worldwide Pod. And then we also have an email address, is worldwidepod11@gmail.com.
Great. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thank you, Steve.